Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är komponerad av Testbild och den fina loggan till podden är skapad av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om Yuzna. Yuzna är producenten, manusförfattaren och ibland regissören som gjort det som jag och flera av mina vänner önskar de hade lyckats med, nämligen att göra film av H.P. Lovecrafts verk. Inte mindre än 4 filmer: Re-animator, From Beyond, Dagon och Necronomicon. Sedan så råder ju såklart viss debatt om hur bra de här filmerna är. De är ju mer en sorts popcornversioner med action, äventyrsmoment, gummimonster, sex och blod. Lovecraft hade vänt sig i graven. Men jag minns att jag som 13-18-åring hade stor behållning av dem. När jag var 14 år så åkte jag över till Köpenhamn. Jag hade de oklippta skräckfilmer till försäljning och den första filmen jag köpte var Bride of Re-animator, regisserad av Yuzna. Jag hade redan sett Re-animator som gjort enormt intryck och uppföljaren var bra på ett helt annat sätt. Den var bizarr med grotesk freakshow av zombier gjorda av special effects-geniet Screaming Mad George, en person som Yuzna gärna samarbetar med. Jag var vid denna unga ålder djupt imponerad och som Brian gärna påpekar själv när man intresserar sig för skräck i ung ålder.
Really, I think most people that are horror fans later in life were probably bitten by the bug really early. I think that if you don't become a horror fan till you're a teenager, till adolescence, which is sort of the normal, that's sort of the time when people are interested in sex and death. I think if you start liking horror when you're 11, you're probably going to be over it by the time you're 22. But when you get infected when you're 6, it may not be curable. And I think for me it was some weird movies and comic books. And of course I was around when there were still the EC Comics types of comic books. And I lived in a country in Panama where there wasn't any television to speak of until I was getting older. So there was really movies and there was comic books. And I lived in kind of a third world country where people told stories in the evening that were very horrific and believable, very superstitious. And I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. And I think the best horror comes out of the Roman Catholic tradition. And I think that if you look at a vampire movie, for example, in the West, that's based on, the Bram Stoker type of stuff, which is very religious, sort of morality based. It's much richer than the vampires in Asia, which just sort of kind of come and go. And, in Asia, it seems like the morality is never that big of a deal. And, it just doesn't have that incredible angst that I like in horror. And I think also sort of the prohibition against sex that Catholicism has also helps make horror better. The more taboos there are, I think, the better the horror is.
So, what kind of horror stuff inspired you when you were young?
When I was growing up, I saw a lot of horror movies. When I would see the movie, I would get the books. They used to have books based on the movies. So I saw all of the Corman Poe movies and then got the paperbacks at the drugstore. And I read ghost stories. I would read anything weird and fantastical. I read, from the time I was, 6 years old, I read tons of fairy tales. And I think fairy tales are a great kind of preparation for horror. Sort of folk tales, they weren't really so much for kids. Maybe they were for scaring kids, but they were pretty heavy duty, and I loved that fantastical part of it. So when I was when I was growing up, I tried reading the classics as well. I'd read like Bram Stoker, H.G. Wells. Of course, I loved Sherlock Holmes as well, which isn't horror, although you might say Hound of the Baskervilles. And Edgar Allan Poe, which was a little tougher because he wasn't so plot-heavy. Anything like Jules Verne, Mary Shelley. And when I read, the one that really got me was Dracula. And I thought that Bram Stoker, and it turns out Dracula was kind of a found footage novel. It was the equivalent of the Blair Witch Project in that it was all about, you were just reading somebody's journal and then you were reading a newspaper article. And so it was almost like you were finding these materials. And it was really horrific, very sexual underneath it all. And I think that the first part of that book, Jonathan Harker's journal, when he's at Dracula's castle, is some of the greatest. I've never seen it really done in the movies the way it reads.
Man måste till exempel vara noga med hur man inleder en intervju, för det är enormt svårt att ställa fråga nummer 2 när han pratar och bara går vidare till nästa och nästa ämne hela tiden. Plötsligt så har det gått 2 timmar. So you read a lot of the classics, but is there any contemporary books, horror books that you like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of stuff. I read some Stephen King. I thought Pet Sematary reminded me of the kind of stories we used to hear in the dusk in Panama about things crawling out of the ground. So I think I think The Shining is great. It's got some great scary parts to it. And yet it also is like overloaded with stuff. The way Stephen King, especially later on, his books he would just go wherever he could. It feels like he never went back and rewrote them, never edited them. And I get that feeling with a lot of successful writers. Once they get when you read something like Carrie, you get the feeling that this little book has been sort of distilled to be as good as it can be, you know. Later, I think if you wrote Carrie now, it would be like 1,000 pages, you know. It would just go on. There would be all kinds of stuff in there. And one of the books that I always thought was one of my favorites was I Am Legend, a disaster out of the movies, just an embarrassment out of the movies. But I think I Am Legend in some ways, George Romero says it was his inspiration for Night of the Living Dead. And I would say Night of the Living Dead is the beginning of modern horror. You know, the horror phase we're in now, at least in the movies. I remember quite vividly when I first saw that movie in the late 60s, when it first came out, and it was shocking. Of course, today you can watch it, and the kids can watch it on TV and not be shocked. But it was shocking at the time, and also shocking in the concept. It was sort of, you know, Living Dead without the religious aspect, without the voodoo. And there was an indication that somehow it was a satellite that came back from space, or who knows. But it was really I think, you know, it was a really scary movie. I Am Legend was actually about vampires. You know, I think Anne Rice had it clearly right in Interview with a Vampire, and where she had the vampire looking for more of his own kind. So he goes to Europe, and in Eastern Europe he finds them, but they're ghouls eating dead flesh in the graveyard. They're disgusting. They're vampires, and so there is you know, I've also read a lot of books about horror, and it's a kind of a common idea that vampires and zombies are really part of the same. They're really the same creature. They're two sides of the same coin.
När jag träffade Brian Yuzna första gången var jag på turné med min kortfilm Demonen, Inviting the Demon, och Brian var imponerad. Han sa att han ville samarbeta. Jag var överväldigad, men tiderna hade redan förändrats och efter den stora börskraschen och tilldelningsinferno fanns det inte samma pengar att få tag på längre. Brian hade svårt att få pengar till sina egna filmer och hade vid det tillfället inte regisserat en film sedan 2010. Vad som gjorde intryck på mig var också Brians skamlöshet. Han pratade om pengar, pengar, pengar och tjäna pengar. I Sverige är det otroligt fult, men det var just det som var nyckeln till hans framgång och en egenskap som jag helt saknade i mitt eget konstnärskap. Trots sitt prat om pengar hela tiden och att man har svårt att få en syl i vädret under ett samtal är Brian Yuzna en person som man på något oförklarligt sätt gillar direkt. Could you tell me about Re-animator and how you started making Lovecraft films?
When I made I'd never read Re-animator, but when I met Stuart Gordon, and with the idea of having him direct a movie, he had already developed Re-animator. So he already had made a script for a TV show. So it was a 50-page script. And I loved the idea, but I didn't want to make TV. I wanted to make a feature. So then we developed the script into a feature film script. So at that point then, of course, I read the stories. And of course, the Re-animator stories are not cosmic horror. They're not the typical Lovecraft stuff. It's actually very traditional monkey's paw, telling stories of people crawling out of their graves in the dusk. It's that kind of gritty, kind of old-fashioned horror. And I love that part of it. And so we developed, so then from that, making that movie, then I started thinking, then we looked for another Lovecraft movie to make. Even while we were shooting it, we said, oh, let's make another one. And so then Stuart suggested Shadow over Innsmouth. And so I hired Dennis Paoli to write a script based on it. And except I called it Dagon because I thought the title Shadow over Innsmouth was too vague and soft. And I liked the name Dagon because it seemed mysterious and strong, And it is connected because Dagon is the monster. Of course, it took almost 20 years to get that movie made through a lot of circuitous developments. But then we had a deal to make another Lovecraft movie, and at that point, then I started getting serious. And I had a partner of mine at that time who was a lawyer, went to Washington, D.C. to the Library of Congress. This is before internet, of course. You couldn't look anything up unless you went to the library, and to look up the copyrights. So what I did is I just started reading all the Lovecraft short story compilations. So I just read everything and then picked out the stories that I thought would make cool movies. One was From Beyond and the other one was Dreams in the Witch House. And we ended up going with From Beyond because it had a machine. And a machine is always good. You kind of want to have a central image. And with the central image with Re-animator, the original script ended with Halsey getting killed. So when I read the stories and we were developing it, I said, hey, whatever you do, I want to see the guy carrying his head around, because I loved that stuff when I was a kid. I loved, House on Haunted Hill, carrying the head. I loved the talking head movies, The Brain That Wouldn't Die, and movies, They Saved Donovan's Brain, and all these movies where you'd have heads cut off. And I remember there was a comic book called Harold Head, where he was just a head, but he had great powers. He could float around, and actually he could get all the women to fall for him, but he couldn't do anything except with his tongue. Of course, it was an underground comic. It was a kind of pornographic. So the idea of the head is what I love, that, and the legions of the dead and stuff. So then the movie, the script was developed to take that into account, and Hill was brought in as the antagonist. That became the main symbol of the movie, a guy carrying his head, in fact. So with From Beyond, you had the symbol would be the resonator, this thing that would take you to another dimension. And so that helped. I think that helps a lot. I always think, what's the image here? So for example, with Return of the Living Dead 3, I felt like she had to be the central image. And so then I came up with this idea that she would have glass sticking out and metal. And that would, of course, I made it have a logic to it. But the image came before the logic.
Ja, som ni märkte så var det svårt att komma till tals. Det blev väldigt långa utläggningar. Men en film som jag ville prata om som Brian hade gjort var Necronomicon. Necronomicon var en Lovecraft-film i 3 stycken segment, där varje segment var regisserad av en enskild regissör och med ett så kallat wraparound runt om, en ramhistoria. Ramhistorien handlar om Lovecraft själv som kommer till ett gammalt kloster för att hitta Necronomicon. H.P. Lovecraft spelas av Jeffrey Combs. Jeffrey Combs som spelar Herbert West, huvudrollen i Re-animator. Han spelar H.P. Lovecraft i en väldigt snygg make-up med lösnäsa och löshaka. Faktiskt väldigt porträttlik Lovecraft. Jag gjorde mitt bästa för att försöka tala med Brian i icke-ekonomiska termer. Hur kom storyn till? Men som ni kommer att märka så var det hopplöst. Could you tell me how the story behind the film Necronomicon started out? Not financially, but content-wise, the story.
Said it before, it's just it was a financing experiment, and an experiment in working with Asian, European, and American elements. So then each director, because the producers came in as partners, they could choose their own director. I didn't choose the directors. And the directors could choose their own Lovecraft story, so long as it was a Lovecraft story. And then they could have their own writer write it. And then I had a writer in LA rewrite all the stories with the director, just to make it all be in the same format, and that we could make sure that the storytelling style was kind of a Hollywood style, because sometimes a European director will tend towards making something that's not as clear, and so it'd be very what is considered ambiguous, although I don't quite buy that, because I think ambiguity should be, it could be A, B, or C. But if ambiguity means we don't know what it means, to me that's not ambiguous. That's just unclear. The Asians tend to have a kind of a logic that kind of really works for like J-horror, because we say, wow, it's Japanese. Why would you do such a stupid thing? Oh, it's Japanese. Well, can't have that in an English language. You want to have some logic to it. So anyway, we tried to give them all kind of a beginning, middle, and end. And I think they all have it. And then finally, I chose a story, a style that I hoped would give a balance to it, after the others had theirs. And everybody got to choose their story. So the one I chose was The Whisper in the Dark, because I love that story. But I had a completely different take on it when we began. So the first version I had took place in the countryside, and it had to do with crop circles. And it was very rural. But then after Christoph Gans took what he called Hotel of the Drowned, and Shusuke Kaneko had Cool Air, then I thought that maybe I needed something more gritty and dirty, something more urban and, you know, a little more nasty or something. I don't know why. I was just afraid that they would all be a little too lyrical. We would get bored. That's what I was afraid of. I was afraid that you can't just like all of a sudden slow down again and have somebody going out into a farm, and you know. So I just thought, well, I'll just start with a police chase and just have it get weird and strange, and still it has a vague. I mean, it's definitely is Lovecraft, but it's also very psychological. And just as Christoph's is very Lovecraft, but it's also like the best Roger Corman Poe movie you ever saw in style, you know. And so anyway, the content, I don't know why Shisuke wanted to do Cool Air, but it's a great story, you know. And I think Christoph, he chose the so-called Hotel of the Drowned, and did a very, I mean, it's a very artistic movie, but with real horror in it.
Jag har pratat med regissörer som till exempel Richard Stanley, som har försökt få sin Lovecraft-film gjord i hur många år som helst nu. Det vill säga, det som investerar och producerar kan känna lukten av ambition. Man brinner för ett projekt. Det blir på något sätt avtändande när man är för entusiastisk, och då kan man ju enligt dem jobba gratis och så vidare. Och det är just det som är nyckeln till Brian Yuznas framgång, och att han gjorde det som många av oss önskar att göra, Lovecraft-film. För att han var ingen direkt fan av Lovecraft. Det var lite skitsamma vad det blev, så länge det blev bisarrt och blodigt, vilket var det som tilltalade honom, hans personliga smak. Jag var också nyfiken på ett projekt, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Älsklingar krympte barnen, som faktiskt var Brian Yuzna och hans kollega Stuart Gordon, deras originalstory, och enligt vad jag hört Stuart Gordon skulle regissera den filmen.
That's a different story, because now you're dealing with a institution and a company that has really, really big time, smart, competitive people. And so now you're really in the Shark Tank, because it turns out people will work against you. Well, when you're doing little stuff, nobody's working against you hardly. There's nobody around, you know, there's not enough money involved. But at Disney, when Stuart and I got the green light to go forward with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and they have all these really big time producers and directors on the lot developing stuff. And now all of a sudden, these young guys that don't know anything come in and take one of the slots. This gets to be very tricky. So it was really a bath of fire, that one, you know, but it very stressful. But of course, when it works, the payoff is wonderful, because you have a movie that, you know, millions of people see. You know, you make a horror movie, Necronomicon. How many people have seen that movie?
När jag hörde så var Brian inte så sugen på att prata om just detta. Det var antagligen väldigt för ångestladdat. Jag hörde ryktas om att Stuart Gordon fick en hjärtattack och blev utbytt mot en annan regissör under inspelningen. Och första gången jag träffade Brian Yuzna så berättade han att den stora behållningen med hela det projektet var att efteråt, när alla leksakerna kom ut och Happy Meal-grejerna på McDonalds och sånt där från Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, så kände Brian en väldigt speciell känsla, sa han till mig, att han hade på något sätt påverkat kulturen, att någonting som han hade fantiserat ihop på något sätt hade påverkat den stora allmänheten och var ute i ett sorts kulturellt omlopp, eller vad man ska kalla det för. You've always been a very creative person. Can you tell me a little bit about how you started your creative path?
I always liked to draw, and I did try to write, and I always identified I was always into art. I played music. I always worked. You know, my dad always made me have a job from the time I was 11. You know, I came from a generation where you had a job when you went to school, you know, and or after school. And so I always made money. And I liked making money, And I always, even early on when I was a teenager, I realized I had these two parts of me. One was the creative, and the other was I liked business. But then I went up to New York. This was in the 70s, up to Soho, which was the big art scene then. And when I went up there, I really didn't like it. And I didn't like the art community. I just felt like it was too pretentious, and I didn't know how to judge so much. It just seemed like everybody was trying to have other people think they were great. And so when I got into movies, I really loved it, especially the part, if people buy a ticket, it's worth that. If you spend $10 to watch the movie, it's worth $10. You know? And I like that part of it. Now, of course, you can make your own aesthetic matter to you, but ultimately, you know, I feel like yes, there is an aesthetic value to things that aren't necessarily completely attached to an audience's response to it, because you have a response. But there's another part, which is that, you know, if you're going to spend a lot of money on a movie, you got to get it back. I always like the idea of being a professional movie maker, making my living doing that. So in a sense, I think I would have gone a lot further in the movies if I had found the person I admired the most and just apprenticed myself to them for nothing, just to learn at a high level. But I didn't. I learned from the streets. So I've always done things on my own and tried to adjust my thinking according to my experience. The first time I tried making a movie, I had a 16mm movie camera, and I really loved the process, and I would watch it. I thought it was wonderful. And so I transferred it to a VHS, and then I triumphantly took it to show to my friends, and I was devastated. It was probably one of the worst experiences of my life. They all were trying to be very positive, but just watching it, I could feel that it wasn't working. But when I watched it by myself, I thought it was wonderful. When I watched it with the people who made it with me, I thought it was so entertaining. And then I watched it with friends, with an audience. And after they're going, yeah, that was really good, you know. I was devastated. Then after that, when I would finish a feature, when I finally, this is, you know, back before digital and all that, but when I would finally get a copy of it, say with Bride of Re-animator, and then I would get in my bedroom with my TV and I would watch it all alone. And I would enjoy the hell out of it. I'd love it. And then I knew it would never be that again, because that was just the pleasure of having completed it and seeing in it the things that I saw while I was making it, and see the struggle that it was, but not have to deal with the objective part of it, which is the struggle doesn't communicate. Quite frankly, once people watch the movie, it starts not being yours, starts being theirs. And, you know, I've been through a lot of that. It's very painful to make a movie and then have to watch it with people. It's very painful. It's never as good as you wished, and it's never as bad as you're afraid. You really need a strong ego, I guess. You really need I admire the people who are so sure of their talent and what they're doing that they could just piss on the audience, you know? If they don't like it, they don't know what they're talking about. I don't feel that way. I'm always being hurt by the response. Ultimately, my goal was always to make a living doing it. I never had the impetus that, oh, I have something very special to say, or, you know, I have to, you know, I'm a great artist or something. That never really was part of the equation. I just wanted, I loved horror movies, so I'll make horror movies. And quite frankly, it would be difficult for me to make a movie that didn't have something really weird in it, whether it's horror or fantasy. It would just leave me flat. So I tend to just always go there. And sometimes I think, gee, why haven't I had bigger successes? Why aren't I a much bigger guy in the industry? Because I am an egotist. I think I'm as smart and talented as any of those fools, right? So then you think, well, that wasn't really your goal, was it? And that sort of goes with that whole, be careful what you wish for. If you wish to make a living making movies, that maybe you get what you get. And maybe you find out as you're going is other people are getting a lot more out of it, you know? Maybe I should change the goalpost a little bit. But that's hard to do.
Finally, do you have any advice for all the creative people out there listening to this podcast?
Take the creative side very seriously, but I think you should also, you should really put out a lot of product. You should do a lot of work. And then you should not shut yourself off from the response of the people around you. Not that you have to give in to their criticism, but you should at least listen and try to understand why and see if you can find an audience.
Ja, och med de orden så avslutar vi. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller och musiken är gjord av Testbild. Hej då.